Let's take a look at lesson 17.1, translations. This is the first type of transformation in this module that's a rigid motion. So we'll be looking at two more types of rigid motion. That's why these are all put together. Translation is something that you learned in Math 7, but you learned it on a little bit more basic level. So we're going to add another layer on top of that. So a translation is just taking a figure and sliding it over. We're not changing the size of it. So if you look here at the very bottom, we're not going to actually do any paper folding or anything. But we'll start with a pre-image, and then we're going to slide it into a different location. You see it's the same size. It preserves length and angle measure. It doesn't change any orientation, right? It doesn't rotate or anything like that. It's not flipped because we're going to be dealing with the rotations and flips on the next couple lessons. On the next page is our definition of a vector. And a vector is actually going to give us a way to do translations a little bit differently than the way that you learned it. So a vector looks like this. Looks like this right here. A vector is a quantity that has both direction and magnitude, and the direction is indicated by the arrow. The magnitude is the same thing as saying the length of it. So although a vector looks just like an array, the arrow means it goes on forever. A vector actually ends at the terminal point right here. It starts at the initial point, ends at the terminal point, and it's only that length or that magnitude. And so you don't need to know the terms initial point and terminal point. Just know where it starts, where it ends. We have two ways of naming a vector, and it uses not a full arrow, something that kind of looks like a half arrow, or I don't know, you can use your imagination. Looks like something, but it's not a full arrow. And if you read the box below, we're going to be using vectors to describe translations, and also we're going to be using vector notation, or what's called component form, in order to do translations. On page 836, number 4, let's do this translation along the vector that's given to us, vector v. So the vector, remember, is going to tell us which way to translate this thing and also how far to translate it. That's the direction and the magnitude. So you see the arrow means that it starts at the other endpoint and it's going to end where the arrow is. And if you want to, you don't have to actually just go along that straight line. We can do something that sort of looks like a slope. So from our initial point, I can count how many times I go over, and that looks like 5 times. And then I'm going to go down 2 times. And again, remember to go in that direction. I'll do the exact same thing with the points A, B, and C, and I'll show you what the image looks like, and also how you see the vectors within that translation. So from point A, let's start here. If I go 5, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the left and 2 down, there's A prime. My vector looks like this, if I were to draw it. Now what you might notice is that the vector that I just drew, it should have both the same direction and the same magnitude as the original vector. And if you read the box a couple pages ago, it talks about the two vectors being parallel when you actually use it. Let's do the other points. And if you understand this, go ahead and move ahead of me. So at point B, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the left and 2 down. There's B prime. There's the vector. And from C, I end up down here, C prime. And there's the vector. And so you're pretty much applying this vector multiple times depending on how many points there are. And then once you get all of your image points, you connect them together. And another thing you should notice once you get your image is that the new triangle that we get has to be the result of a rigid motion, which means it's preserved length, it preserves angle measure and all that, right? So it should be exactly the same shape. Learning this last year, you may remember writing what's called a coordinate rule for this translation. So I'll show you the new way learning about vectors that we're going to write it today. Coordinate rule would always start with x comma y. And then we had to figure out what are we doing to x and y to show that it's doing this translation. Well, it's moving to the left, which affects the x coordinate. And we're moving to the left 5 times, so it would be x minus 5 for our x coordinate. And then we had to move down 2 times. That would be y minus 2. So if you don't remember this from last year, this is just to jog your memory a little bit and to show you the vector notation. This might also be called the vector rule. It might also be called component form. In your actual assignment, they're going to use the words component form. And that just means write it as a vector. A vector is kind of written like a point. So try to understand how I'm coming up with these numbers. Okay, -5 comma -2. That's our vector that we're using. And that means for the x, it's always the x that's written first. So for the x, we're going left 5, and for the y, we're going down 2. Now, to make this not look like a point, we don't use parentheses. We use this. Kind of looks like angle brackets, or I don't really know what to call it. But it looks like that, just so you know we're not talking about a point, we're talking about a vector. On page 837, we have your turns, number 5, number 6. I'll do one of them, and I'll have you try the other. We're going to draw the pre-image and the image of each triangle under the translation of vector, the vector in component form, -4, 1. So if we do a little bit of planning first. The vector that it gives us in the directions up here, think about which way this is going. Right? So this is the x part of the vector notation, and this is the y part. So the -4 means we're going to be going to the left 4 times. And then the positive one means we're going up. So let's go ahead and do number 5. A is at 2, 4. And one important thing is make sure that you are labeling your points, both your pre-image points and your image points with the prime symbol. Here's B and C. And when it gives you several points, go ahead and connect them to make a figure. So let's go ahead and translate this. If I take the component form or the vector notation, I'm going to go to the left 4 times and up 1. There's A prime. Point B. 4 to the left, 1 up. And C ends up here. I'm going to connect those. And what you see here is really all you need to do. If you prefer, you can draw the vectors that are connecting. I think it may help catch some mistakes if you miscounted anything, because the vectors will look a little bit different. But if you see the green lines that I drew, that is the actual vector, and they all look just like one another. So go and try number 6. On the top of page 838, let's just take a look at this example where we have the pre-image and the image is drawn. And now we need to come up with that rule. And in your assignment, you're going to be expected to know how to write it in component form for vectors. So what you do is You need to identify which one of these is the pre-image and the image. So you just look for the ones that have just the letters without the prime symbol. And then, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and label it. P for pre-image and I for image. Or you could just go ahead and draw your vector from A to A prime. I'm only going to show that one. If you wanted to draw a vector from C to C prime and from B to B prime, you can. But think about why that's not necessary. We don't have to do that. So I'm just going to do the one. And we need to figure out how do we get from A to A prime, and that's going to determine our vector. So I can figure out here, or just start counting, I guess. It's going to go to the right. Let me use a different color. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times to the right. That's going to be our x, and then up 3 times. Make sure you understand when it's positive and negative. So our vector in component form, I think this is the wording they're going to use in the book, is positive 5 and positive 3. So that's our vector. So there isn't really any practice or your turn here for you to do this, but do go to the assignment problems and make sure you're practicing that enough.